You might have heard about these things called core web vitals. It's these new numbers that Google's come up with, and it's going to become SEO ranking factors here really soon. And so these numbers are really important to affect your rankings in Google, which is obviously something we all care about. So in this video, I want to talk about what those core ranking factors are and what you can do about it. So Google, love them or hate them, they are the main search engine out there right now, okay? Now, one of the things that Google is interested in is the user experience. They want the sites to be really fast, and they also want the sites to be easy to use when they get there. Now, one of the ways is they measure that through, in addition to site speed and stuff like that, are through these new metrics called the core web vitals. And they basically created some nerdy sounding numbers so that they can assign a key performance indicator to some of the things that users actually want. And the idea would be to create a delightful experience for your users. So let's talk about what those core web vitals are. These three numbers are called largest contentful paint, first input delay, and the last one is cumulative layout shift. Now here's what these things are in plain English. The largest content paint is basically a measure of the site speed. Specifically here, it's how long it takes for when the person clicks the link to your site to where the biggest element on the page shows up for them, okay? So that's basically what that is. The next one, which is FID, first input delay, this is the length of time between when they actually load up your page for the very first time, in other words, click on it, to the point where the site is going to be responsive to new user commands. So in other words, it will allow them to scroll, it will allow them to click on things, stuff like that. There's that gap there. The last one is cumulative layout shift. Basically, it's kind of what it says. It's does the site shift? Does it move after it loads up in the browser? You've probably seen sites out there that will load up, and then as new elements are being loaded, things will kind of move around, and it can become a little annoying. Like sometimes you'll be especially on a mobile device, you'll be going to click on something before your thumb even gets to the point of being able to click it, it's moved, and you can't use it anymore. So that makes the site difficult to use. So those are the three metrics: largest contentful paint, the other one is first input delay, the last one is cumulative layout shift. Now you can see here that there are metrics that you're going for. For the contentful paint, you want to keep it under 2.5 seconds, ideally. Anything higher than that, you kind of want to do something about it. For the FID, you want to keep it under 100 milliseconds, okay? And then for the layout shift, you want to keep that under 0.1. Now that layout shift metric is sort of they use a formula in order to come up with that number, okay? But the good news is that you can run speed reports now, and basically it will give you these numbers, and it will literally highlight them green or red or whatever and tell you, if you need to do something about these numbers. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to run some speed tests on your site. Now keep in mind, when you're doing these speed tests, we're not talking about the entire site, we're talking about each individual page. And so if you test out your home page, and then you test out, say, one of your blog posts, you might get completely different numbers just because there are two different pages. So you got to keep that in mind. The other thing about these speed tests is that very often you will get different numbers every time that you run it. So I would recommend that you run it at least 3 times and kind of take a mean average in order to see what the heck's going on. But let me show you how to run those speed tests. Okay, the first place that you can check out is just called simply Page Speed Insights. It's right from Google. I will link to this below the video as well as in the blog post, of course, that this video goes with. But you can see that I ran a quick one for my Blog Marketing Academy homepage. Now, the big thing to keep in mind is that it's going to differentiate between mobile and desktop, and that is important. And you can see on my mobile, at least as of now, I've got a little bit of work to do here, okay? Now, this is some historical context here for the overall site, but then you got the lab, which is going to it's testing this specific page. So I've got some work that I need to do on the mobile side of this, but the good news is that over on my desktop side, I'm really doing pretty well. I mean, there's really not a lot that needs to be addressed here. I think my layout shift is a little high, but really not alarmingly so. And quite frankly, that layout shift metric here, let's see, here we are. I'm just a hair. I think 0.1 is actually the threshold to be in the green, and I'm 0.15. So I'm doing pretty well. But you know, that's basically that. 95 is a pretty decent score. So basically, you just take your URL to your homepage, to any page of your site, and just click analyze, and that works. Okay. The other place you can check out is called Gtmetrix, gtmetrix.com, and you can run the exact same report, and it just presents it differently. So you can see that I did one here on my homepage yet again. My scores are pretty good. Once again, my content layout shift a little on the high side. It is giving me a different number, which is interesting. And it gives you some screenshots of what it's looking like. If I look at this speed visualization, if I can say that word, I can kind of see what may be causing the layout shift. Because if you zoom in here, see how for some reason this thing is seeing my header area on my site showing up big, and I don't know what this is all about. And then it goes to the way it's supposed to. So something shifted in there. I don't know what it is, but that's probably the source of it. Okay. Now you do get some recommendations down here, but it can be a little hard to figure out exactly what to do about it in some cases. Sometimes it's pretty clear, like properly size your images. Okay. It'll help identify to you some of the images that you might want to look at. Okay. And you can see if you can resize those things or shrink them or optimize them, whatever. The large layout shifts, unfortunately, when you look at this type of data, all you get is some HTML. It can be a little bit annoying to go in there and try to find out what the heck that is. So you got to just do the best that you can. Now you can also test this in your actual browser as well. Here we are on my homepage, of course, and we're going to go ahead and test it right here in browser. Now keep in mind, for this, I am using Brave Browser, which is a Chrome-based browser. So if you're using Chrome tools and you're using a Chrome-based browser, or perhaps Chrome itself, you'll have this built in, as long as you're using the more recent version. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click. We're going to click on Inspect, and it's going to pop up these developer tools, okay? Now, yours may show up over on the side. I've got mine aligned here at the bottom, and this gives you a bunch of geeky stuff where you can kind of look at your code and see how things are structured. Okay. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to go over to click on Lighthouse, okay, which is an open source piece of software that does speed tests. And in fact, Page Insights and stuff is using Lighthouse. We're going to go ahead and generate report. And it's just going to do what it does. It's going to gyrate. It's going to do what it's supposed to do. I have desktop mode selected, by the way. And it's going to spit a report at me in just a minute. There we are. So there I am. I've got a 98 on here, which is a pretty good score. A couple yellows here, but it's not too bad. 87. I mean, that's a B, right? But it gives you some ideas on what you need to do. Interesting with me is on here, my largest contentful paint is good. First contentful paint, it gives you different metrics. My layout shift is actually in the green here when I'm testing it locally. So again, you want to take all these things into account, and you want to not take any one tool as gospel. You want to test things out, okay? But you can actually test this out right there in your browser, right on your own machine. Okay, so the next question is, what do you do now? Okay, you got these numbers, all right? How do you go about improving them? Now, this can get really nerdy, but I'm going to very specifically not get nerdy, okay? Because this is a very classic example of 80-20 rule. You can get yourself a really far amount just by doing some of the basic stuff, using some plugins and doing some best practices. So we'll cover those briefly here, okay? Once you get past that, it starts to feel like squeezing juice out of a turnip. It can get to be a little bit annoying dealing with a bunch of geeky stuff, and you just want to see how far you can get at doing the basics first. All right, you can see that at least on the desktop right now, I'm getting some pretty solid scores on blogmarketingacademy.com. I'm doing that just by doing some basic practices and using a performance optimization plugin. So let's go over that right now. First and foremost, do you have solid web hosting? You absolutely do need to have solid web hosting, because that's probably one of the biggest things you can do regarding the speed of your site. Now, I'm a fan of two big companies, okay? One is Siteground. I am a fan of Siteground, and it's generally what I recommend to most of my students when they're first asking me what they should get, okay? And you could check out Siteground, definitely well known. All right, that's not any mystery. The other one that I really like is called Cloudways. This is actually what I am using right now. blogmarketingacademy.com, the lab, everything that I do is hosted here at Cloudways. And so I'm using a virtual private server, gives me a lot more resources. It's very, very affordable. I get all the conveniences like staging sites and all that good stuff. So there you go. It gives my sites breathing room to process things and be able to serve up a quick website. So hosting is definitely an important thing that you need to look at. Is your host good? Okay, the next thing is going to be relevant to you if you're running a WordPress-based membership site. And I know a lot of my students do, okay? In that case, do you have it separated out from your main site? Because here's the thing, your membership site is going to have plugins and stuff that is going on. It needs to remain very dynamic, and that's because it's a membership site, whereas your public site is not, okay? It's pretty much static. You've got blog posts, and SEO and speed is way more important on that site than it is inside the membership site. And so that is one of many reasons why I recommend that you keep your membership site and your public marketing site separate. Two different WordPress blogs, just put the membership on a subdomain and keep things nice and clean, because that means that you can optimize your public blog as much as possible for speed, because you don't really need to worry about that as much inside the private site. Okay, the next one is, are you using caching on your site? You really should be. On a public site especially, you have no excuse not to be using it. So basically all this is static copies of your website that do not need to be processed again. They don't need to do database queries and all that. It just kind of serves it out there. So it makes it a heck of a lot faster, speeds up the site for the end user. Now there's a lot of ways to do this, but just install a plugin and make it work. I'm using one called the Breeze plugin because it's actually created by Cloudways, and basically I just check some boxes and turn it on. And it also has a CDN option built in, so this is something that I set up with Cloudways. Works out really well, but it has exceptions and all kinds of stuff that you can do. But you definitely need to be using some type of a caching plugin. I use Breeze. You don't need to. You could use W3 Total Cache. There's WP Rocket. There's a whole bunch of these things out there. If you go and search for WordPress caching plugins, you're going to find many. So you just pick one. Sometimes you'll find a plugin that can do a bunch of performance optimizations as well as caching, and that could be an option for you as well. But again, I'm using Breeze by Cloudways because I'm hosted with Cloudways. So that caching plugin is going to do a lot to speed up your site, but you probably also, and you definitely will, you will want to run another plugin that can do just performance optimization for WordPress. Now, like I said, sometimes you'll find a plugin that does both in the same setup, like WP Rocket. The one that I really like myself is called Perf Matters, okay? Performance matters, because it certainly does. Over here on my site, we've got Perf Matters. This is what it looks like, but there's all kinds of things like various WordPress things like emojis, embeds, all this kind of stuff that I can disable because it's stuff that you may need in some capacities, but a lot of times you're not using it, and it will just kind of add extra payload. Okay, by turning that off, it speeds things up. I can disable Google Fonts, so it's not pulling that up anymore. Disable comments. I'm not doing that because I do have comments on my site. I can limit post reversions in order to save space in the database. I could use this to actually run a CDN, but being that I'm using Breeze to do that, I don't use these options. Real quick, if we go back to options under lazy loading, this is where you can actually make images not show up until they're actually in view in the browser. So that can save some space. This feature here with the YouTube preview thumbnails is a really cool feature of Perf Matters, where if you're embedding a video, like I do very often at blogmarketingacademy.com, it will pull in just the preview image and put a little arrow over the top, which is a lot faster than doing the whole iframe thing and all the YouTube overhead. And so it won't actually load up the YouTube stuff until they actually click the play button. So that speeds speeds things up quite a bit. Okay, so there's some cool things that you can do with this plugin. Google Analytics, obviously you can integrate with Google Analytics via this plugin, but you can also host the Google Analytics script locally rather than pulling it in from Google every single time. So that just reduces the number of requests that the browser needs to make and speeds things up. If we go to extras, you got other things you can do, add code to the various parts of your site, which is useful. Under assets, you can defer JavaScript. This one right here is a really important one to hit because it'll get rid of that, I forgot what they call this, but in the reports, like the render blocking scripts or something like that. I'm going out of memory here. A lot of times just by checking this box, that will get that number down quite a bit for you. Okay. The script manager, I'll show you in just a minute because that's a really cool feature of this. But there's other things that this does, and it's all designed to increase the performance of your site. I think I took my desktop scores from the low 70s up to, as you saw earlier, 95 to 98, basically just by playing with Perf Matters settings. Okay, so it's a really, really cool plugin, and it's also very lightweight. It doesn't come with a lot of overhead in and of itself, so it's a very, very optimized plugin. So that brings me to plugins. Now, just as a general thing, definitely you need to not run more plugins than you actually are using. I've been into many people's sites and I see that they went out and purchased some plugins or a set of plugins because they were told it was really good, and they just kind of activate them all, okay? Even if they're not even using it. So the thing is every time you add plugins to WordPress, you are increasing the footprint. It has to then run more code, and therefore it slows down the site, and it will load up additional resources even if you're not using them. So just as a general rule of thumb, only activate the plugins that you're actually using. If you're not using it, turn it off, okay? Now, even with that said, you're probably going to end up with a decent list of plugins, because if you're anything like me, you're going to end up with plugins you're like, I am using that, even if it's only on one page, and then you have to keep it active. There's a way that you can handle that as well. Let me show you. All right, here inside of Perf Matters, yet again, we've got this script manager, and you can see that I have it turned on. So here's what this does. This allows you to enable or disable plugins on a page-by-page basis, okay? And the way that it's accessed is via the admin bar that's active up across the site. And if you, for some reason, are hiding your admin bar here when you're actually logged into your own site, there is an alternative way to access it. But you'll see that I've got Script Manager here. Watch what happens. I'm on my home page, open this bad boy up. Here we are. Okay, and you can see that this is a list of plugins that I have activated basically on this site. However, I can go down the list and disable the ones, checking this little toggle, that I'm not using. Okay, so like here's Fluent Forms. I really like this. It's for forms. I really only need that on my contact page, though. I really don't need it any place else, especially my home page. And so I turn it off, okay? I turn off the add-on pack. I turn off Imagify because it's not really being used there. I turn off Presso Player because it's not being used on the home page. You get the idea. Any plugin that I'm not using. So here's my social media sharing buttons. I'm not using them on my home page, so I turn them off. Every time I turn these plugins off, it is setting it up so that it just will not load on that page. Now, the cool thing is you don't have to go on every page of your site and do these settings. When I turn it off on one, I can select everywhere, and then I can set exceptions. So what I've done is like Social Warfare Pro, it's disabled everywhere, but the exceptions are that on any of my blog posts or this, which is a custom post type, it is turned on, okay? And that's because that's where I show social media buttons, is on blog posts. Every place else I don't, okay? With the Presto Player, there's only one place currently, as of this recording, that I'm actually using that, and that is on the sales page for the Lab Pro membership. So I disable this everywhere, but then I go over to my sales page, I open up the script manager, and I just set current URL, and that will set that one exception so that Presto Player is now only showing up on that page where it's actually being used, and it's not being activated anyplace else. You get the idea. This right here is a really rarely powerful tool. You could click on over to Global View and get an idea of what's going on. You can disable, if you go down here, You can go down and disable theme elements, WordPress elements, elements of your theme if you just know that it's not being used on those pages. So it gives you a lot of control over the plugins so that you can have them activated on WordPress if you need them, but when you don't need them, you just kind of temporarily turn them off on those pages. And that saves resources. It'll allow you to load up less scripts and be much more efficient. Okay, one other big picture thing that you should really be doing, and that is optimizing your images. Now, ideally, you will be doing this in two different ways. First of all, don't upload anything to your WordPress media library unless you've optimized it locally yourself, okay? Like export it as a web-friendly image, use the right image format, don't take some raw picture off your phone that might be 2 megabytes in size and upload that. It's going to be nasty. Even if it shows up normal in a blog post, it's still going to be loading up a 2 megabyte image, and that's a really bad thing to do. So don't do that. So optimize it on your computer before you upload it. But the other thing is you probably want to use a WordPress plugin that will auto-optimize those images for you. Now, the one that I really like myself is Imagify. This is what I use. And basically, it will actually optimize images as you upload them to your media library. So even though I will do my thing on my own computer to make sure that I'm not uploading crap images or things that are too big, Imagify takes it the extra mile and will optimize, the various versions of the image and stuff like that. So the idea would be that when my images show up in a blog post, that they're as optimized as can be. Okay, so that's a lot of the big picture stuff, really, that's going to get you 80 to 90% of the way on your optimization. Now, I want to address a common question, and I've been asked this before, and that is, does using a page builder kind of mess you up in this regard? If you're using something like Thrive Architect or Elementor or Beaver Builder or Divi or something like that, is the extra overhead going to negatively impact these numbers, these core web vitals? Now, so here's the thing. The first answer is yes. Okay, there's no way to get around that when you add a page builder, it is going to add additional overhead to the site. There's nothing you can do about that. Now, the big thing is you got to look at the trade-offs. The way I look at it, there's a massive amount of benefit and speed and convenience for me, speed of work, by having a page builder like Thrive Architect installed. And I make that decision knowing that having it is increasing the overhead of the site. But the other thing is that with the optimization stuff that we're talking about here, it really negates the impact. And so you can be using something like Thrive Architect or Elementor or something like that, and even though it's adding additional overhead to things, and it's going to be putting some extra HTML into your page, that if you know how to code HTML and you go and you view source, you're like, that's some nasty HTML. That's just kind of the way these page builders operate. But with the right optimizations, a lot of the stuff that I just talked about, you can really negate the impact. And so the real impact in the real world is not that substantial. And in fact, you can see, and I've got a little bit of work to do on the mobile, but my desktop scores were pretty damn good. And that's using Thrive Theme Builder with Thrive Architect in there. And I was getting 95s and 98s on the desktop. So it doesn't have to hurt you. If you're a real purist about this and it really bothers you, then just stick to the WordPress block editor. Admittedly, it is getting better. I'm just not a big fan of the block editor personally. I'd much rather use something that's purpose-built. I prefer Thrive Architect myself. Okay, so that's about it on Core Web Vitals for now. Now, if you're on the blog at blogmarketacademy.com, on the post that goes with this video, then below there's going to be more details about the things we just talked about, and there's going to be some additional stuff that I just don't want to spend the time here on this video to talk about. Some specific things to look for on your page, and I'm also going to give you a little trick that might come in handy when it comes to trying to figure out why your content layout shift or your cumulative layout shift score might be a little high. That particular metric can be a little annoying to figure out because it's sitting there giving you this score and it says that you need to work on it, but you're like, what the hell is making my layout shift? Because it seems really fast to me, right? And so that's a tough one to figure out. And again, think of 80-20 here, do the stuff that matters. You don't have to reach perfection on it. But there's a little trick below that you can do to simulate a super slow internet connection, and maybe you can find out why your layout is shifting. That being said, let's back out. This has been about core web vitals coming from Google. It is going to be more important here in 2021 because they are actually implementing these numbers as SEO ranking factors. So that means that whether we like it or not, our Google overlords are saying that we need to pay attention because they might hit us over the head a little bit with their little hammer if we've got bad numbers on this, okay? So we need to pay attention to it. Love Google or hate Google. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Google, but we got to play ball with them at this point. Hopefully some other search engines will come along. I use DuckDuckGo all day long, but let's face it, most people don't. Most people are still using Google. It is what it is. We got to play the game. So those are the core web vitals. Check out your score, run those reports, and get to work on optimizing your site. Performance is super important. You can't make these decisions just based on the fact that your site looks fine to you. It seems fast to you, but it doesn't mean that it's like that for everybody else because everybody's got different computers, different browsers, different internet connections, different phones. So you got to take these things into account and use your noggin a little bit. Okay, if you've got any questions at all, feel free to ask below in the comments and I'll be happy to help you out. Talk to you later.